Hey guys, tonight we are standing on a shore of cracked, dry earth under a sky that feels impossibly vast and empty. Imagine a world washed clean, silent except for the whisper of the wind over damp soil. The air smells of rain and wet wood and new beginnings. But it's a terrifying new beginning, one born from a global reset you absolutely would not survive. You think you're good at camping. Try doing it for a year on a floating zoo while the world drowns. Yeah, didn't think so. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a comfort to know we're all under the same stars, just in different moments. I'm here in Da Nang, Vietnam, and it's just past 8:30 in the evening. Our story tonight begins not with a whisper, but with a heartbeat. Not just one, but the thrumming, chaotic, beautiful heartbeat of a young world. Picture it in your mind's eye. A world so fresh that the mountains still look sharp, as if sculpted yesterday. The rivers run clear and cold, full of fish with scales that shimmer like scattered jewels. The forests are dense and ancient, filled with trees so tall their leaves seem to brush against the clouds. The air itself is sweet, thick with the scent of blossoms and damp earth and life in its millionfold expressions. In this world, humanity is also young, vibrant, and bursting with potential. They are brilliant. They build cities, they compose music, they create art. They are strong, their laughter echoing through the valleys they've learned to farm. From the outside, it is a masterpiece, a symphony of creation playing out its glorious opening movements. But if you listen closer, beneath the music, there's a dissonance. A low, ugly hum that grows louder with each passing generation. The story, as Genesis tells it, puts it plainly. The earth was filled with violence. It's a simple phrase, but it holds a universe of pain. It wasn't just physical violence, the clash of swords or the breaking of bones. It was the violence of the heart, greed, deceit, a relentless, self-serving ambition that saw other people not as fellow souls, but as obstacles or tools. The strong preyed on the weak, and the clever cheated the simple. Every thought, every imagination of the human heart, the text says, was only evil continually. Imagine that. Not a single moment of pure, selfless intention. It was as if a beautiful song had been rewritten in a key of pure malice. The harmony was gone, replaced by a relentless, grinding noise of selfishness. And this noise, this spiritual static, reached all the way to heaven. It grieved the heart of the Creator. This is one of the most poignant and human-like descriptions of God in the entire Bible. It doesn't say God was merely angry or disappointed, like a king whose subjects have rebelled. It says his heart was filled with pain. It was the grief of an artist who sees his beautiful sculpture being smashed to pieces by the very people it was meant to inspire. It was the sorrow of a composer who hears his symphony being played horribly out of tune, its beauty twisted into something ugly. He saw the potential, the glorious, what could have been. And then he saw the grim reality of what is. And it broke his heart. The text says he regretted that he had made human beings on the earth It is a staggering statement. The regret wasn't a mistake in the design, but a sorrow over the choices freely made. The freedom he had given them, the most precious gift, was being used to systematically dismantle the goodness of his creation. So in the midst of this global cacophony, God finds one man who is listening to a different tune. His name is Noah. Now, the Bible describes Noah in a few very specific ways. It says he was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. And most importantly, it says Noah walked with God. Let's pause on that for a moment, because it's a beautiful and quiet description. It doesn't say Noah was perfect. The word for blameless here doesn't mean sinless. It suggests integrity, wholeness, a life that was complete and sound in its devotion. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't a flawless saint. He was, in all likelihood, a normal man with calloused hands and a family to feed. But in a world where everyone was sprinting in the direction of their own desires, Noah was walking, step by steady step, in the same direction as his Creator, walking with God. It sounds so simple. It's not a frantic religious performance. It's a relationship. It's the easy rhythm of a long-held friendship. It's knowing someone so well you can anticipate their pace. It's sharing a quiet understanding that doesn't need a lot of words. In a world screaming for attention, Noah was quiet enough to listen. While humanity was building monuments to its own pride, Noah was building a relationship. And because he was listening, he heard something that no one else could hear. He heard the sorrow in God's heart. And then he heard a command so bizarre, so utterly illogical, that it would have sounded like madness to anyone else. Build an ark, not a little boat to go fishing in. An ark, a colossal seafaring vessel. The instructions were specific. Make it of gopher wood, cover it inside and out with pitch, and build it to enormous dimensions. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. To put that in perspective, we're talking about a wooden box roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That's about 1.5 football fields long. It was to have 3 decks, a roof, and 1 door in the side. This wasn't a weekend project. This was a life's work. And the reason for it, God's quiet, grief-stricken voice explained. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Can you imagine being Noah in that moment? Standing there on dry land, miles from any ocean, with the sun beating down on you. And you've just been told to build the largest ship the world has ever seen because a flood is coming that will cover the entire world. His neighbors must have thought he'd lost his mind. Every day, for decades, they would have seen him and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, out there. The rhythmic sound of the saw cutting through timber, the sharp thud of the hammer, the sticky, pungent smell of melting pitch. What are you building, Noah? They'd shout, leaning on their fences, a smirk on their faces. A boat, he'd reply, wiping sweat from his brow. A boat, in the middle of this valley. Are you planning to sail on the morning dew? Their laughter would have been merciless. year after year, the mockery must have continued. Toddlers who saw the ark's foundation being laid grew into young men who taunted Noah's sons about their father's folly. It became the local joke, the town's biggest, most absurd landmark. As crazy as old Noah, they might have said. Through it all, Noah just kept building. Every plank cut, every joint sealed, was an act of faith. It was a testament to his trust in the voice he heard when the rest of the world was deafened by its own noise. He was building on a promise of destruction, but also on an implicit promise of salvation. He didn't have a blueprint of God's entire plan. He just had the next step: find the right tree, cut the next board, seal the next seam. He walked with God, one faithful step at a time. And then came the second part of the instructions, perhaps even stranger than the first. He was to bring his family into the ark, his wife, his sons, and their wives. 8 people in total. And then he was to bring the animals, 2 of every kind, male and female. And for the clean animals, the ones suitable for sacrifice, he was to bring 7 pairs. Not only that, but he had to gather enough food to sustain this floating menagerie for an unspecified amount of time. Let's just try to picture the logistics of this. This isn't just about opening the door and yelling, "Everybody in." This is the greatest zoological migration in history, orchestrated by one family. Imagine the procession. The slow, lumbering elephants, their great, wrinkled ears flapping. The graceful giraffes, having to duck to get through the enormous door. Pairs of lions, bears, and wolves, their wildness seemingly subdued for this one divine purpose. And think of the smaller creatures, the armadillos, the hedgehogs, the scurrying families of mice, and the birds, flocks of them swirling in the sky before settling into their designated places within the massive structure. Can you imagine the sound? The air filled with a chorus of roars, chirps, squawks, and grunts. And the smell, a rich, earthy aroma of fur, feathers, and hay. Noah's family had to organize it all. They had to build stalls and cages, store mountains of grain, dried fruits, and hay. They had to figure out how to manage predators and prey living in close quarters. It was an impossible task, an exercise in faith that went beyond just building a boat. It was about trusting that God, who had commanded this strange zoo, would also provide the peace to maintain it. For all those years of building, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. The story tells us. His sermon wasn't delivered with words from a pulpit. His sermon was the sound of his hammer. Every strike was a warning. Every plank laid was an invitation to a world that refused to listen. But no one came. No one else wanted a ticket. They were too busy with their own lives, their own plans, their own noise. Finally, the day came. The last peg was hammered in. The last bale of hay was stored. The final pair of hesitant lemurs scurried up the ramp. Noah and his family, standing at the entrance of their colossal wooden sanctuary, took one last look at the world they knew. The world that had laughed at them, that had dismissed God's warning as the ramblings of a madman. And then, with all of creation's representatives safely aboard, something incredible happens. Noah doesn't close the door. Genesis is very clear about this detail. Then the Lord shut him in. It's a powerful image. The one door to the ark, the one path to safety, was closed not by human hands, but by God Himself. It signifies the end of the time of warning and the beginning of the time of judgment. But it's also an act of profound protection. God Himself sealed them into their refuge. He was the lock on their door, the guardian of their home. For 7 days, they waited inside the ark. 7 days of silence. The world outside went on as usual. The sun rose, the sun set. People went to work. They married, they gave in marriage, completely oblivious to the fact that their time was up. Inside the ark, it must have been a week of tense, quiet anticipation. The calm before the storm. The family and the animals living in a strange twilight, waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. And then it began. It didn't start with a gentle pitter-patter. The Bible describes it with cosmic violence. All the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. This wasn't just rain. This was the world coming undone. Water erupted from the ground and cascaded from the sky simultaneously. It was a relentless, vertical assault of water. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell. Not a drizzle, not a shower, but a deluge. A constant, deafening roar on the roof of the ark. Inside that wooden shell, the world for Noah's family was reduced to the sound of water and the rocking of the waves. It was dark. The single window was high up, offering little light. Their days were governed by the rhythm of the ship and the needs of the animals. They would have moved through the cavernous decks by lamplight, their footsteps echoing in the vast, shadowed spaces. They fed the animals, cleaned the stalls, and prayed. They must have felt the ark begin to shift, to groan, and then to lift. The surreal sensation of their home, their refuge. A massive structure built on dry land, now floating. They were rising, lifted up by the very waters that were destroying everything they had ever known. They couldn't see what was happening outside, and perhaps that was a mercy. They were spared the sight of the chaos, the panic, the destruction. Their entire reality was the creaking wood, the lowing of cattle, the smell of damp hay, and the endless, percussive drumming of the rain. 40 days is a long time. It's a period of testing, of purification. Imagine the conversations they must have had, huddled together in the lamplight. The fear, the doubt, the questions. Did they wonder if they had made a mistake? Did they mourn for the world they had lost, even as wicked as it was? They were human. They must have felt the immense weight of their survival, the loneliness of being the last 8 people on earth. Their faith was not a one-time decision. It was a choice they had to make every single day for 40 days, in the dark, with the sound of judgment all around them. And then, after 40 days, the rain stopped. But the ordeal was far from over. The world was a universal ocean. The water covered everything, even the highest mountains. The ark, a tiny speck of life on an endless expanse of water, just drifted. For 150 days, the waters prevailed. 5 months. Imagine the monotony, the waiting. Their world was water and sky. There were no landmarks, no sense of progress, just the gentle rocking of the waves, day lives were a cycle of chores and waiting. It's in these long, quiet stretches that faith is truly forged. It's easy to be faithful in a moment of crisis or a moment of miracles, but to remain faithful through the long, unchanging, boring middle, that is the real test. They had to trust that the God who had shut them in had not forgotten them. And he hadn't, Genesis says. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. Remembered. It doesn't mean God had a memory lapse and suddenly thought, "Oh, right, Noah." The word carries a sense of faithful, covenant-keeping action. God remembered his promise. He remembered the man who walked with him. And so he acted. He sent a wind to blow over the earth, and the waters began to recede. Slowly, painfully slowly, the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens were closed. The water level started to drop, inch by painstaking inch. After months of drifting, one day there was a jolt, a scraping sound from the bottom of the ark. It had come to rest. The text says it rested on the mountains of Ararat. They were grounded. They were no longer adrift, but they still couldn't leave. The world was still a watery landscape. They had to wait, more waiting. They could see the tops of the mountains appearing like small islands in a vast sea. The view from their high window was changing day by day. Hope was returning to the world. Noah, ever the careful and patient man, devised a plan to see if it was safe. 40 days after the mountaintops were visible, he opened the window. First, he sent out a raven. The raven is a scavenger, a hardy bird. It flew back and forth, probably finding places to land on carrion floating on the water's surface, until the water had dried up. It didn't give Noah the specific information he needed. So, a week later, he sent out a dove. The dove is a different kind of bird. It's gentle. It needs a clean place to rest. The first time, the dove flew out and found no place to perch, so it returned to the ark, and Noah reached out his hand and brought it back inside. It was a sign, not yet. The world wasn't ready. He waited another 7 days. A week of looking at that dove, a symbol of a hope not yet realized. Then he sent it out again. This time, the dove returned in the evening, and in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. An olive leaf. It's impossible to overstate the power of that image. It was the first sign of new life, green, living, a promise that the earth was healing. That somewhere, a tree had survived and was putting forth new shoots. It was a message of peace, a botanical telegram from a reborn world. There must have been such joy in the ark that night. The relief, the tangible proof that their long, dark confinement was finally coming to an end. Noah, being the patient man he was, still waited another 7 days. He sent the dove out one more time. This time, it did not return. It had found a home. The earth was habitable again. The world was ready. Finally, after more than a year sealed inside that wooden refuge, the command came again from the God who had first told him to build. Come out of the ark. On the 27th day of the 2nd month of Noah's 601st year, he opened the door. The door that God had shut was now opened for a new beginning. Imagine that moment. stepping out of the darkness of the ark into the bright sunlight, the fresh, clean air filling their lungs, the silence. The world was washed clean. There were no cities, no roads, no signs of the old, violent civilization. Just the earth, damp and fertile, under a wide-open sky. They were standing on a mountaintop, looking out at a world that was both familiar and entirely new. A blank slate. A second chance for humanity. The animals came out, blinking in the sun, stretching their legs after a year of confinement, and began to disperse across the new landscape to be fruitful and multiply. What is the first thing Noah does in this new world? He doesn't scout for a place to build a house. He doesn't immediately start planting crops. The very first thing he does is build an altar to the Lord. He took some of all the clean animals and clean birds and offered them as burnt offerings. It was an act of worship, of gratitude, of acknowledging the God who had preserved them. It was a costly sacrifice, taking from the precious few animals he had, but it was a necessary one. It was his way of saying, "Everything we have is because of you." And the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. This is another one of those beautiful anthropomorphic phrases. It's not that God literally has a nose and enjoyed the smell of roasting meat. It signifies that Noah's act of faith, his heart of gratitude, was received and accepted. It pleased God. And in that moment of acceptance, God makes a promise. He says it in his heart, a vow to himself that will change the course of his relationship with humanity forever. He says, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." This is the very core of the first great covenant. Let's break it down because it is astonishing. God has just wiped the world clean because of human wickedness. And now, looking at the tiny remnant of humanity, he acknowledges that the fundamental problem hasn't been solved. The human heart is still inclined towards evil. The reset button on the world did not reset the human heart. And yet, in the face of this unchanging reality, God's response is not to plan for another flood. His response is grace. He promises to work with humanity as they are, not as he wishes they would be. He limits his own wrath. He binds himself with a promise. He continues, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." This is a promise of stability, of predictability. After the chaos of the flood, where the natural order was completely upended, God promises a return to rhythm and routine. The seasons will follow each other. The sun will rise and set. Farmers can plant seeds with the confidence that a harvest will come. The very foundation of civilization, the ability to plan for the future based on the predictable patterns of nature, is a gift from God, enshrined in this promise. He is promising a stable stage upon which the rest of the human story can play out. Then God speaks the promise aloud to Noah and his sons. He blesses them, telling them to be fruitful and multiply, echoing the original blessing in Eden. He formally establishes his covenant, not just with Noah, but with his descendants and with every living creature on the earth. This is crucial. This covenant is universal. It's not just for one family or one nation. It applies to every human being and every animal that would ever live. Every sparrow, every whale, every person from that day to this lives under the protection of this promise. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. A promise, especially one this big, needs a sign, a reminder, a tangible thing that can be seen and touched to anchor the promise in the physical world. A covenant sign is like a signature on a contract or a wedding ring on a finger. It's the visible evidence of an invisible reality. And the sign God chooses for this covenant is one of the most beautiful and breathtaking sights in all of nature. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Imagine that moment. Noah and his family standing there on the damp earth, smelling the smoke from the altar. And as God speaks, the first rainbow arcs across the sky, a brilliant spectrum of color against the gray, receding storm clouds. It must have been an awe-inspiring sight, but it's more than just beautiful. In the ancient world, the bow was a weapon of war. It was a symbol of power and judgment. When a warrior was finished with a battle, he would hang up his bow. God takes this symbol of warfare and completely transforms it. He hangs his war bow in the sky, and he points it upwards, away from the earth. It is a symbol of peace, a declaration that his war against the earth with water is over. And God says something remarkable. He says, "Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant." He sets up the sign not just for us, but for himself. It's not that God is forgetful. It's a way of saying that he has bound himself to this promise so completely that the very sight of the rainbow triggers his own faithfulness. Every time a storm passes and the sun breaks through the rain, that arc of light is a divine reminder, a reassurance from the Creator to his creation that his promise holds. It is a quiet, colorful whisper that says, "You are safe. I will not destroy you. My default setting is grace." So this is the first covenant, the Noahic covenant. It's the foundation upon which all the others are built. It doesn't solve the problem of sin in the human heart. We'll see that story continue to unfold. It doesn't make humanity perfect, but it does guarantee a stable world where God can continue to work out his plan of redemption. It's a promise of cosmic patience. God is choosing to deal with human evil through a long story of grace and intervention, rather than a short, sharp act of destruction. Every time we see a rainbow, we are being invited back into this ancient story. We are being reminded that the world we live in, with its predictable seasons and its stable ground, is not an accident. It is a gift sustained by an unbreakable promise. It's a promise made to all of us, regardless of who we are, where we live, or what we believe. It's God's baseline commitment to the world before he gets specific with one family or one nation. He makes a universal promise of preservation to all of creation. It's the ultimate declaration that, despite the brokenness he sees, he is not giving up on his world. The story of humanity is not over. In fact, thanks to this rainbow promise, it has only just begun. It's a promise that says, even after the most devastating storm, there is always the hope of new life. There is always a new beginning, and there is always the light of grace breaking through the clouds. And that is a comforting thought to hold on to as the world outside your window settles into the quiet of the night. The ground beneath you is firm, not because it is inherently stable, but because it is held in place by a promise. A promise sealed with a rainbow. The rainbow had faded, but its promise lingered, woven into the very fabric of the new world. Humanity, starting again from that small family of 8, did exactly what they were told to do. They were fruitful, and they multiplied. The earth, once silent and empty, began to fill again with the sounds of life, of villages growing into towns, and towns into the beginnings of powerful city-states. But as you'll recall from our last story, the flood washed the world clean, but it didn't wash the human heart clean. The inclination that had caused such grief before was still there, a quiet, stubborn weed in the garden of the soul. And it wasn't long before that weed grew into a towering monument of human pride. You know the story. It's the one with the Tower of Babel. Humanity, now speaking one language, unified in purpose, decided to build a city with a tower that reached to the heavens. Their stated goal: let us make a name for ourselves. It was the opposite of Noah's first act of building an altar to God's name. This was a monument to human achievement, human unity, and human independence from their Creator. It was a declaration that they could reach heaven on their own terms. And God, seeing this unified arrogance, knew it would only lead to greater and greater evil. So he came down, and in an act that was both judgment and mercy, he confused their languages and scattered them across the face of the earth. The great project was abandoned, and humanity was fragmented into different peoples and nations, each going its own way. It might seem like the plan was failing again, but God's response this time wasn't a global flood. His memory, his promise sealed by the rainbow, held firm. Instead, he initiated a new plan, a quieter, more intimate, and in some ways, a more radical plan. If humanity as a whole would not seek him, he would choose one man, one family, and through them, he would create a people who would be a beacon of his light to the scattered nations. He would start small. He would zoom in from the wide-angle shot of all humanity to a close-up on a single, unsuspecting individual. His name was Abram, and he lived in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. To understand how radical God's call was, you have to understand Ur. This wasn't some backwater village. Ur was a metropolis. It was a center of culture, commerce, and technology in ancient Mesopotamia. It was sophisticated, with paved streets, 2-story houses, and a complex system of laws. It was also deeply, thoroughly pagan. The city's patron deity was the moon god Nana, and a massive ziggurat, a stepped temple tower, dominated the city skyline. This was the world that Abram knew. He was a city dweller, steeped in a culture that worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses who were fickle, demanding, and often cruel. Abram's family, the text tells us, were idol worshippers themselves. He was not a man who was already seeking the one true God. He was just a man living his life. And there's another crucial detail about Abram. He was 75 years old. His wife, Sarai, was 65. In the ancient world, a person's legacy, their very identity, was tied up in their children. A large family was a sign of blessing, of security, of a future. And Abram and Sarai had no children. The Bible states it with heartbreaking simplicity. Sarai was barren, she had no child. They were a dead end. An elderly, childless couple in a culture that prized descendants above all else. Their story, by all earthly logic, was over. They were just waiting to live out their final years and fade into obscurity. It is to this man, in this place, at this time in his life, that God speaks. We aren't told how. There were no burning bushes or angelic choirs at this point. It might have been a quiet voice in his heart, an undeniable, unshakable conviction. But the message was clear, and it was an earthquake that would shatter the foundations of Abram's entire world. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Let's just sit with that command for a moment. Go, leave everything. In that culture, your identity was your land, your people, your family. To leave them was to become a nobody, a vulnerable wanderer with no social safety net, no protection, no inheritance. And where was he to go? To a land I will show you. Not a map, not a set of directions, not even a destination name. Just go, and I'll tell you when you get there. It was a call to absolute, unconditional trust. It was a call to step out of the boat of everything he had ever known and walk on the water of a divine promise. And what a promise it was. Accompanying the difficult command was a sevenfold blessing that must have sounded like music to the ears of a childless old man. God says to him, I will make you into a great nation. The first promise directly addressing Abram's greatest lack. You, the man with no children, will become the father of a nation. I will bless you. A general, all-encompassing promise of divine favor and provision. I will make your name great. In a world where men were trying to make a name for themselves by building towers, God promised to make Abram's name great for him, and you will be a blessing. This is the pivotal point. The blessing wasn't just for Abram. It was meant to flow through him. He was to be a conduit of God's grace to the world. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. This was a promise of divine protection. To be Abram's friend was to be God's friend. To be his enemy was to be God's enemy, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And here, the plan zooms back out to the whole world. This wasn't about creating one favored nation for its own sake. It was about choosing one man to make one nation, to ultimately bring blessing to all the scattered nations of the earth. problem of Babel would be reversed through the family of Abram. It was an impossible promise given to an unlikely candidate. But the Bible records his response in one simple, profound sentence. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him. He packed up his belongings, gathered his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, and set out. He traded the security of the known for the uncertainty of a promise. He left the towering ziggurat of the moon god behind to follow the unseen voice of the one true God. It was perhaps the single greatest act of faith in human history, the hinge upon which the entire story of salvation would turn. Their journey was not a magical, effortless teleportation. It was a long, dusty trek. They traveled north along the Fertile Crescent, a journey of hundreds of miles, until they came to a place called Haran. There, they settled for a time, until Abram's father, Terah, passed away. Even in his obedience, Abram was patient. Then the call came again, and at 75, he resumed his journey south into the land of Canaan, the land the voice had promised him. When he arrived, what did he find? It wasn't an empty paradise waiting for him with a welcome mat. The land was already occupied. The Canaanites were then in the land, the text notes. It was a land of powerful, fortified city-states. And worse, there was a famine in the land, a severe famine. Abram arrives in the promised land, only to find it occupied and starving. This was his first test. Did he turn back? Did he accuse God of making a false promise? No. He built an altar. Just like Noah, his first response was worship. He built an altar at Shechem and another near Bethel, and he called on the name of the Lord. He was staking a spiritual claim, marking this foreign land with acts of devotion to the God who had brought him there. But the famine was severe, and Abram was human. His faith, though remarkable, was not yet perfected. Faced with starvation, he made a pragmatic decision. He took his family down to Egypt, a land famous for its grain and its stability, thanks to the Nile River. And it is here that we see the first wobble in his walk of faith. He was afraid. He knew that his wife, Sarai, was a very beautiful woman, even at 65. He feared that the powerful Egyptians, especially Pharaoh, would kill him to take her. So he concocted a plan, a half-truth that was a whole lie. "Say you are my sister," he told Sarai, "so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." It was a plan born of fear, not faith. He was relying on his own cleverness to protect himself, rather than on the God who had promised to bless those who blessed him and curse those who cursed him. And just as he feared, Sarai's beauty was noticed. She was taken into Pharaoh's palace, and Abram, in exchange for his sister, was showered with wealth, sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, servants. He got the material blessing, but he had compromised his integrity and lost his wife. He had traded God's protection for a short-term, fear-based solution. But here is the beauty of the covenant. It depended on God's faithfulness, not Abram's. Even when Abram stumbled, God upheld his promise. The text says the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. God intervened to protect the promise, to protect the future mother of the promised nation. Pharaoh, figuring out what had happened, was furious and terrified. He summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. There's a deep irony here, as the pagan king schools the man of faith on his deception. Pharaoh immediately returned Sarai and sent them away, along with all their newfound wealth. Abram left Egypt a much richer man, but also a humbled one. He had learned a powerful lesson. God's promise was not dependent on his own perfect performance. God was faithful even when he was faithless. He returned to the land of Canaan, to the very place where he had built his first altar, and once again he called on the name of the Lord. It was an act of recommitment, of returning to his first love. His wealth and the wealth of his nephew Lot had grown so much that the land could not support them both. Their herdsmen began to quarrel. Abram, now acting with the grace and wisdom of a man who had been humbled, showed his true character. He said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." He gave his younger nephew the first choice. Lot looked up and saw the plain of the Jordan, well-watered and lush, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt he had just left. It was the prime real estate. He chose it for himself, settling near the wicked city of Sodom. Abram was left with the hill country, the less desirable, more arid land. But after Lot had gone, God spoke to Abram again. He comforted him and reaffirmed the promise. "Look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." It was a powerful reassurance. Lot had chosen the best land by sight, but Abram was being given all of it by faith. The promise was still intact. It had not been diminished by famine, by his failure in Egypt, or by giving up the best land to his nephew. Still, the years were rolling by. Abram was getting older. Sarai was getting older, and there was still no child. The promise of being a great nation felt distant and abstract. The ache of childlessness was a present, daily reality. And so, one night, under the canopy of the desert sky, Abram brings his doubt, his deepest question, to God. This conversation, recorded in Genesis chapter 15, is one of the most intimate and foundational moments in the entire Bible. Abram says, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." He's basically saying, God, your promises of blessing are wonderful, but they feel hollow without an heir. As it stands, my chief servant is going to get everything. Is that what you meant? It's a raw, honest complaint. It's the prayer of a man whose faith is being stretched to its breaking point. God's response is immediate and definitive. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And then God does something beautiful. He doesn't just give a verbal promise, he gives a visual one. He takes Abram outside his tent. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Imagine Abram, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, tilting his head back. The desert sky, with no city lights to dim its glory, would have been a breathtaking spectacle. A river of light, a dense, glittering blanket of countless stars. He was being asked to count the uncountable. And as he stood there, speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the cosmos, God's voice came again, quiet and sure. So shall your offspring be. In that moment, faced with the staggering visual evidence of God's creative power, something shifted in Abram's heart. The Bible records it in a sentence that would echo through the rest of Scripture, quoted by apostles and theologians for millennia to come. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This is the heart of faith. It wasn't about Abram's good works or his moral perfection. It was simply that he took God at his word. He believed the impossible promise, and in God's eyes, that act of trust made him righteous. It put him in right standing with God. But God knew that Abram, being human, needed more than just a verbal promise, even one illustrated by the stars. He was going to formalize this promise in a way that Abram would understand completely. He was going to cut a covenant. God tells Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram did as he was told. Then he did something that seems utterly bizarre to us. He cut the larger animals in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. This was a known, though rare and serious, way of making a covenant in the ancient world. It was called a self-maledictory oath. The two parties making the treaty would walk together down the path between the bloody pieces of the animals. In doing so, they were implicitly saying, "If I fail to keep my end of this agreement, may I become like these animals." It was the most solemn, binding oath one could possibly make. It was signing a contract in blood. So Abram prepared the animals. He stood guard over them all day, shooing away birds of prey. He had done his part. He waited. As the sun began to set, a deep, terrifying sleep fell upon him, a supernatural dread. And in the darkness, God spoke to him, foretelling the future of his descendants, that they would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, but that God would deliver them and bring them back to this land. And then, as the darkness became absolute, something incredible happened. A smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch. These are symbols of God's own presence, what theologians call a theophany. Fire and smoke, recalling the pillar of fire and cloud that would later lead Israel out of Egypt, and the smoke and fire on Mount Sinai. And this presence, this representation of God himself, passed between the pieces. But where was Abram? He was asleep. He was a passive observer. He did not walk between the pieces. Only God did. The meaning of this is stunning, and it is the absolute core of what makes this covenant so unbreakable. God was taking the entire oath upon himself. He was saying, "I swear by my own life that I will keep this promise to you. If this promise fails, may I be torn asunder. The fulfillment of this covenant depends entirely on my faithfulness, not yours." Abram brought nothing to the table but his belief. God brought the promise and the power to keep it, and he signed the contract with his own divine presence. This is a covenant of pure grace. Abram's descendants will fail. They will stumble. They will disobey. God has already foretold their slavery, but the covenant will hold because it rests on the character of God alone. The reassurance was powerful, but the reality of their aging bodies remained. 10 more years passed. Abram was 85. Sarai was 75. Still no child. The promise felt like a distant dream, and Sarai, a pragmatic and desperate woman, came up with a plan. It was a common custom of the time. She said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Her slave was an Egyptian woman named Hagar. This was another moment of wavering faith. Just as Abram had relied on his own cleverness in Egypt, Sarai was now relying on a human solution, a cultural workaround, to fulfill a divine promise. It was an attempt to help God, to force his hand. Abram sadly agreed, and the result was not the joyful fulfillment they had hoped for, but immediate heartbreak and conflict. Hagar conceived, and filled with a new sense of status, she began to despise her mistress. Sarai, filled with jealousy and bitterness, mistreated Hagar so badly that she fled into the desert. It was a domestic tragedy born of doubt and impatience. Even in this self-inflicted mess, God showed his compassion. He met Hagar in the desert, comforted her, and promised to make her son, Ishmael, the father of a great people as well. He sent her back, and Ishmael was born. Abram was 86 years old. He now had a son, but Ishmael, the son of human effort, was not the son of the promise. The covenant would not be fulfilled through him. God's plan would unfold in God's time and in God's way. 13 more years of silence passed. An entire childhood for Ishmael. Abram was now 99 years old. It would have been easy for him to assume that Ishmael was the fulfillment, that God's promise had been realized, albeit in a messy, unexpected way. Then, God appeared to him again. "I am God Almighty," he began, introducing a new name for himself, El Shaddai, emphasizing his power to overcome all obstacles, even old age and barrenness. "Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers." He was reaffirming the promise, making it clear that his plan was still on track. And to mark this new stage in their relationship, he gave them new names. "No longer will you be called Abram, which means exalted father. Your name will be Abraham, which means father of a multitude. For I have made you a father of many nations." He also changed Sarai's name. "You are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name is Sarah, princess. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her." New names signified a new identity, a new destiny. They were to live into the reality of the promise, even before it was fulfilled. Abraham, the 99-year-old father of one was to start calling himself Father of a Multitude. And then God established the sign that would accompany this covenant. It was not a beautiful, ethereal sign like the rainbow. It was an earthy, permanent, physical sign: circumcision. Every male in Abraham's household, and all their descendants after them, was to be circumcised on the 8th day of life. It was a sign in the flesh, a permanent marking of the body. It was a constant, physical reminder of who they were, a people set apart, a people in a covenant relationship with God. It was a sign that this covenant was to be passed down through the generations, through the very line of descent that God had promised. It was also a symbol that the human heart needed to be circumcised, that the fleshly, human efforts to achieve salvation needed to be cut away, leaving only trust in God's promise. And Abraham, true to his faith, obeyed immediately. He took all the males in his household, including himself at 99 and Ishmael at 13. And on that very day, they bore the sign of the covenant. Shortly after, the story takes an almost comical turn. As Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, 3 men, 3 visitors appeared. With the customary hospitality of the time, Abraham rushed to greet them, bowing low and offering them water, rest, and a meal. He didn't know who they were, but he treated them as honored guests, preparing a feast for them. As they were eating, one of them, who is clearly identified as the Lord himself, asked, "Where is your wife Sarah?" Abraham replied, "She's in the tent." Then the visitor made a startling announcement. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah was inside the tent, just behind the flap, listening. And when she heard this, she laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was the cynical, bitter laugh of a 90-year-old woman who had carried the shame of barrenness her whole life. A baby. Now, it was beyond ridiculous. It was biologically impossible. The Lord, knowing her heart, asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?'" And then he spoke the question that is the very theme of Abraham's story. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah, afraid, denied it. "I did not laugh," she said, "but the Lord knew." Yes, you did laugh. It was a moment of profound human doubt colliding with absolute divine power. But God was not offended by her laughter. He would have the last laugh. A year later, just as he had promised, at the appointed time, Sarah, at the age of 90, gave birth to a son. And Abraham, at 100 years old, held the child of the promise in his arms. And they named him Isaac, which in Hebrew means, "he laughs." Sarah declared, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The bitter laughter of disbelief had been transformed into the pure, bubbling laughter of joy. Isaac was the living, breathing, gurgling proof that God keeps his promises, that nothing is too hard for him. The promise of descendants, as numerous as the stars, had begun with one miraculous, laughter-filled birth. The years that followed must have been filled with a joy that Abraham and Sarah had never thought possible. Isaac grew from a baby to a boy, the center of their world, the embodiment of all their hopes. And then comes the final, excruciating test of Abraham's faith. A test so severe, it is almost unbearable to read. God speaks to him again. "Abraham." "Here I am," he replies. And the command comes, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there. As a burnt offering on a mountain, I will show you." It is the most brutal command in the Bible. Every word is designed to twist the knife. Your son, your only son, a poignant dismissal of Ishmael's status in the covenant line. Whom you love. God was asking Abraham to take the promise itself, the child of laughter, the miracle baby, and destroy him with his own hands, to place him on the altar and kill him. It was a command that seemed to contradict the very nature of God and the foundation of the covenant. What does Abraham do? He doesn't argue. He doesn't question. The Bible simply says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. The silent obedience is staggering. For 3 days, he traveled with his son, 2 servants, and the wood for the offering. Can you imagine the agony of that 3-day journey? Every step, every glance at his beloved boy must have been torture. On the 3rd day, he saw the place in the distance. He told his servants to wait. "We will worship, and then we will come back to you," he said. Even in this, a flicker of faith that somehow both he and Isaac would return. As they walked up the mountain together, Isaac, the boy, asked his father the most innocent and heartbreaking question. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's reply is a masterpiece of anguish and trust. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. They reached the place. Abraham built the altar. He arranged the wood. He bound his precious son, Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. He reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. In that final, terrible moment, as the knife was raised, the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." Jehovah Jireh. The test was over. Abraham had proven that he loved the giver of the promise more than the promise itself. He was willing to surrender even the most precious gift back to God, trusting that God's plan was greater than his understanding. And because of this ultimate act of faith, God swore an oath and reaffirmed the covenant in the strongest possible terms. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." This is the Abrahamic covenant. It's a story that begins with one childless old man in a pagan city and ends with a promise that will bless the entire world. It's a covenant of grace, sealed not by human effort, but by God's own faithfulness, symbolized by that smoking firepot passing alone between the pieces. It's a promise of land, of descendants, and of a blessing that would flow out to all people. Abraham's story teaches us that God's plans are not limited by our circumstances, our age, or our abilities. He chooses the unlikely, the barren, the forgotten, to accomplish his glorious purposes. He calls us out of our comfort zones into a journey of faith where the destination is not always clear, but the companion is always faithful. And he proves, time and time again, through the laughter of a new mother and the ram caught in the thicket, that he will always provide. This intensely personal promise to one man and his family would become the foundation for the story of an entire nation, and through them, a story of salvation for us all. Abraham, the father of a multitude, eventually rested with his ancestors, as did Isaac, the son of laughter, and Jacob, the wrestler who was renamed Israel. The promise God made under the starry sky was beginning to sprout. Jacob's 12 sons became the patriarchs of 12 tribes, a burgeoning family that was, against all odds, starting to look like the beginnings of a nation. But if you remember the strange and dark prophecy God gave to Abraham during that terrifying, sleepy dread, you'll know that the path to nationhood wasn't going to be a straightforward walk into the promised land. God had told him that his descendants would be strangers in a country not their own, where they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And so, the story takes a sharp turn, leading them out of the promised land of Canaan and down into the great, sun-drenched empire of Egypt. It happens, as these things so often do, through a family drama of jealousy and betrayal. Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, a dreamer and perhaps a bit of a braggart, was sold into slavery by his own brothers. They dipped his ornate coat in goat's blood and presented it to their father as proof of his death, a lie that would haunt their family for decades. But as Joseph would later say, what his brothers meant for evil, God intended for good, through a miraculous series of events involving false accusations, prison, and the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph rose from the lowest pit of slavery to the highest position of power in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. He became the administrator of the entire empire, and with divine wisdom, he saved the known world from a devastating famine. It was this famine that drove his unsuspecting brothers down to Egypt, desperate for grain. And there, after a series of dramatic tests and a heart-wrenching revelation, the family was reconciled. Joseph, far from seeking revenge, embraced his brothers with tears of forgiveness and brought the entire clan, all 70 of them, down to Egypt to live in the fertile land of Goshen. They were safe, they were prosperous, and they were together. The prophecy had begun. They were strangers in a land not their own. For a time, life was good. They were honored guests, the family of the great vizier Joseph. They multiplied exceedingly, filling the land. But generations passed. Joseph died, his brothers died, and eventually a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new Pharaoh looked out at the burgeoning Hebrew population, and he didn't see the relatives of a national hero. he saw a threat. He saw a foreign people, numerous and strong, living in the strategic heartland of his empire. What if a war broke out? Would they side with Egypt's enemies? And so, fear turned to oppression. Pharaoh decided to crush them, to break their spirit and control their numbers. He made them slaves. The sons of Israel, who had entered Egypt as guests, now found themselves under the lash of the taskmaster. They were forced to build the great storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses, toiling under the brutal Egyptian sun, making bricks of mud and straw. But the harder they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. The promise was still at work, even under the weight of slavery. Pharaoh's plan was failing, so he escalated his cruelty to a horrific new level. He gave a command to the Hebrew midwives: when you attend a birth, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. He was attempting to commit genocide, to sever the future of the people of the promise by destroying all the male heirs. But the midwives feared God more than Pharaoh, and they let the boys live. In a rage, Pharaoh issued a public decree to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. It was the darkest of times. The hope of Abraham's promise seemed like a cruel joke. The chosen people were enslaved, and their future was being systematically drowned in the great river of Egypt. It is in this crucible of suffering, under the shadow of a death decree, that our next central figure is born. A woman from the tribe of Levi had a son. He was a beautiful child, and for 3 months she hid him. But you can't hide a growing baby for long. With a heavy heart, she did what Pharaoh had commanded, but with a mother's desperate, faithful twist. She didn't throw her son into the Nile, she placed him on the Nile. She wove a small basket of papyrus reeds, sealed it with tar and pitch, a miniature ark, and placed her beloved child inside. She set it among the reeds along the riverbank, a prayer set afloat on the very waters that were meant to be his grave. And she sent his older sister, Miriam, to watch from a distance. As fate, or rather, as Providence would have it, Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket, and her heart was moved with pity for the crying Hebrew child. In that moment, Miriam, brave and quick-witted, ran up to her. "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. The princess agreed, and so Miriam brought her own mother. The baby's mother was paid by Pharaoh's daughter to nurse her own son, and when the child was old enough, she brought him back to the princess, who adopted him and named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." So Moses, the Hebrew child who should have been drowned, was raised as a prince of Egypt. He received the finest education, learned the ways of the court, and was steeped in the power and privilege of the empire that was oppressing his people. Yet, something of his true identity must have lingered in his heart. One day, when he was a grown man, he went out to where his own people were, and he saw their suffering. He watched an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and in a flash of righteous anger, he looked around, saw no one, and killed the Egyptian, burying him in the sand. He thought it was a secret. But the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting and tried to intervene. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" One of them sneered. "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Moses was terrified. When Pharaoh heard of it, he tried to kill him, but Moses fled. He ran far away across the desert to the land of Midian. The prince of Egypt, the would-be deliverer of his people, was now a fugitive and an exile. His first attempt to save his people by his own strength, his own violence, had failed disastrously. He settled in Midian, married a woman named Zipporah, had a son, and became a shepherd for his father-in-law, Jethro. For 40 years of silence, 40 years of wandering the backside of the desert, leading sheep. The fire of his youth was banked. The prince became a humble shepherd. He learned the ways of the wilderness, the names of the stars, the locations of the wells. He was being stripped of his Egyptian pride, humbled, and prepared for a task he could never have accomplished in his own strength. During those long 40 years, the king of Egypt died, but the suffering of the Israelites did not end. Their groaning rose up to God, and the Bible says that God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. That word again, remembered. It was time to act. One day, Moses was leading his flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, and he saw something strange. A bush was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. The flames licked at the leaves and branches, but they were not consumed. It was a paradox, a quiet miracle in the middle of nowhere. Intrigued, Moses turned aside to get a closer look. And as he did, a voice called to him from within the fire. "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he answered, his heart surely pounding in his chest. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then the voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God, the God of his ancestors, the God he had likely only heard about in whispered stories, was speaking to him from a burning bush. And he had a mission for him. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. And so now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses, the 80-year-old shepherd with a criminal record back in Egypt, was stunned. His response was not a confident, "Yes, Lord." It was a series of 5 very human, very relatable excuses. First, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? It's a question of identity. I'm a nobody, a failed revolutionary, a humble shepherd. And God's answer doesn't build up Moses' ego. He simply says, "I will be with you." The mission wasn't about who Moses was. It was about who was with him. Second, Moses asks, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" It's a question of authority. Who are you? The Egyptians have dozens of gods with names and functions. What's your name? And God's response is one of the most profound moments of self-revelation in Scripture. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." In Hebrew, the name is YHWH, derived from the verb to be. It's a name that speaks of eternal self-existence, of unchanging faithfulness, of ultimate reality. He is the one who simply is. He is not a God made of wood or stone. He is the living God who was, and is to come. Third, Moses says, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" It's a question of credibility. How do I prove this isn't just some sun-baked desert hallucination? So God gives him 3 signs. His shepherd's staff will turn into a snake and back again. His hand will become leprous and then be restored. And as a last resort, water from the Nile will turn to blood. These were signs of power, a taste of the authority he would wield. Fourth, Moses objects, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been an eloquent man. I am slow of speech and tongue." It's a question of ability. I'm not a good public speaker. I can't inspire people. God's response is a gentle rebuke. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Finally, after all his objections have been answered, Moses makes one last, desperate plea. "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." It's the raw voice of fear. "I don't want to do this. I'm scared." God's anger burned, yet he still showed grace. He conceded that Moses' brother, Aaron, who was a good speaker, would meet him and speak for him. And so, with his excuses exhausted and his brother by his side, the reluctant prophet, armed with nothing but a shepherd's staff and the name of I Am, went back to Egypt to confront the most powerful man on earth. The confrontation with Pharaoh was not a single event, but a long, drawn-out battle of wills. It was a cosmic chess match. Pharaoh, who was considered a god by his people, against the unseen God of a nation of slaves. Moses and Aaron would go before Pharaoh and say, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go." And Pharaoh's repeated, arrogant response was, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." So God began to teach Pharaoh and all of Egypt exactly who he was. He did it through a series of 10 plagues, 10 acts of judgment that systematically dismantled the Egyptian pantheon and demonstrated God's absolute authority over every aspect of creation. The Nile, the source of Egypt's life and worshipped as a god, was turned to blood. Frogs, a symbol of fertility, swarmed the land. Gnats and flies, representing other deities, became instruments of torment. The livestock, sacred symbols of wealth and divine power, were struck with disease. The people themselves, including the priests who prided themselves on their ritual purity, were afflicted with boils. A devastating hailstorm, unheard of in Egypt, destroyed the crops. A swarm of locusts devoured whatever was left. A thick, oppressive darkness, a direct assault on the sun god Ra, the chief deity of Egypt, covered the land for 3 days. With each plague, Pharaoh's heart grew harder, his pride refusing to yield. It all culminated in the 10th and final plague, the most terrible of all. God announced that at midnight he would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn son, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl at her hand mill, and every firstborn of the livestock would die. It was a judgment that would strike at the very heart of Egypt's future and its pride. But for his own people, God provided a way of escape. This is the Passover. Each Israelite family was instructed to take a year-old male lamb without defect. They were to slaughter it at twilight, and then, using a branch of hyssop, they were to paint some of its blood on the tops and sides of the doorframes of their houses. They were to roast the lamb and eat it that night in haste, with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. They were to eat it fully dressed, with their cloaks tucked in, sandals on their feet, and staffs in their hands, ready to leave at a moment's notice. The blood on the doorpost was a sign. When I see the blood, God said, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. That night, a great cry rose up from all over Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. But in the homes of the Hebrews, marked by the blood of the Lamb, their firstborn were safe. A nation was born in a single night, redeemed by the blood of a substitute. Pharaoh, his own son now dead, finally broke. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested, and take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go. And also bless me. A humbled God-king, begging for a blessing from the slaves he had oppressed. And so, after 430 years, the Israelites marched out of Egypt, not as fleeing slaves, but as a liberated army, plundering their former masters who were now desperate for them to leave. God had kept his promise. He had rescued them. Their journey to freedom was not over. Pharaoh, his grief turning once again to rage and regret, gathered his army and his chariots and pursued them. He trapped them at the edge of the Red Sea. Before them was the water, behind them, the deadliest army in the world. The people were terrified. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? They cried out to Moses. But Moses, his faith now forged in the fire of confrontation, stood firm. Do not be afraid, he declared. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And the Lord did fight for them. He sent a pillar of cloud and fire to stand between the Israelites and the Egyptians, giving one light and the other darkness. Then Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and all that night, God drove the sea back with a strong east wind, turning it into dry land. The waters were divided, standing up like a wall on their right and on their left. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. When the Egyptian army charged in after them, God threw them into confusion. At Moses' command, the waters returned to their place, and the entire army of Pharaoh was swallowed by the sea. Standing safely on the other side, the Israelites watched as the mighty power that had enslaved them for centuries was utterly destroyed. And Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine and led the women in a song of victory. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. They were free, but freedom, they would soon learn, is more than just the absence of chains. Now came the difficult task of learning how to live as a free people. Their journey to the promised land took them into the vast, unforgiving Sinai wilderness. And this newly freed, traumatized, and deeply immature nation began to complain. They grumbled about the bitter water at Marah. They romanticized their slavery in Egypt. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. They had forgotten the lash of the taskmaster and remembered only the food in the pot. But God, in his parental patience, provided for them. He sweetened the bitter water. He sent them manna from heaven every morning, a mysterious bread-like substance, and quail in the evening. He commanded Moses to strike a rock, and water gushed out for the people and their livestock. He was teaching them day by day to depend on him for their very survival. He was their liberator, and now he was their provider. It was in this context of deliverance and dependence that he led them to the foot of a mountain, Mount Sinai. It was here that he would formally propose the covenant that would define them as a nation. 3 months after leaving Egypt, they arrived and camped in the desert in front of the mountain. And the scene that unfolds is one of the most terrifying and awe-inspiring in all of Scripture. God was about to descend and speak to his people, and he prepared them for it. He told Moses to have the people consecrate themselves, to wash their clothes, and to be ready on the 3rd day. He set a boundary around the mountain that no one was to cross, on pain of death. For the first time, God was not just a distant voice or a pillar of cloud. His presence was about to manifest in a way they could see and hear and feel. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. The whole camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. It was a sensory overload of divine power, a display of raw, untamed holiness that left the people terrified. This was not a friendly, casual meeting. This was an encounter with the Creator of the universe, and it rightly filled them with fear and awe. It is in this context that God, through Moses, makes his covenant proposal. It's found in Exodus chapter 19. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is the heart of the offer. Let's look at those phrases. Treasured possession. The Hebrew word is segula. It means a special, private treasure, like a king's personal jewels. Out of all the nations of the earth, God was choosing Israel to be his own special people, a kingdom of priests. A priest is a mediator, someone who stands between God and people. God was calling the entire nation to be his representatives to the rest of the world, to show the scattered nations of Babel what it looks like to be in a right relationship with the one true God. A holy nation. Holy means set apart. They were to be different from the nations around them in their worship, their ethics, their entire way of life, set apart for God. The proposal was based on what God had already done. He had rescued them. This was a covenant founded on grace. And now he was inviting them into a special, binding relationship. Moses took this message to the people, and their response was unanimous and enthusiastic. We will do everything the Lord has said. They agreed. They accepted the terms. The contract was about to be signed. So God summoned Moses up the mountain, into the fire and smoke, and he spoke the terms of the covenant. The heart of it, the summary of the entire law, is the 10 Commandments. These are not 10 suggestions, they are 10 words, foundational principles for their new life of freedom. You can think of them like the constitution of the new nation of Israel. The first 4 commandments concern their relationship with God. You shall have no other gods before me. Absolute loyalty. They were to be monotheists in a polytheistic world. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Their God was the invisible I Am, not to be reduced to an image of wood or stone. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. They were to treat his name, his very character, with reverence. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 1 day in 7 was to be set aside for rest and worship. A weekly reminder that they were no longer slaves driven by the relentless demands of Pharaoh, but a free people whose time belonged to God. The next 6 commandments concern their relationships with each other, the foundation for a just and healthy society. Honor your father and your mother. This ensured the stability of the family, the basic unit of society. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. These are the basic rules for any community that wants to survive, protecting life, marriage, property, and justice. And the final one, you shall not covet, goes deeper than the others. It addresses the heart, the root of the desire that leads to stealing, adultery, and even murder. These 10 words were the pillars of the covenant, but they were followed by a whole body of supporting legislation called the Book of the Covenant, which applied these principles to the nitty-gritty of daily life. There were laws about slavery, mandating humane treatment and eventual release. There were laws demanding justice for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. There were laws about restitution for damages, about sexual ethics, about religious festivals. It was a comprehensive legal and moral code designed to create a society that reflected the justice and compassion of the God who had redeemed them. It was a gift. It was a roadmap for how to live as God's treasured possession. Moses came down from the mountain and told the people everything the Lord had said. And once again, they responded together, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." Then Moses wrote it all down. The next morning, he built an altar, sealed the covenant with the blood of sacrifices, sprinkling half on the altar representing God and half on the people, and he read the book of the covenant to them. For the third time, they affirmed their promise. "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." The agreement was made. The marriage contract was signed in blood. Israel was now in a formal, binding covenant with YHWH, their king and their God. Then Moses went back up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the law inscribed by the finger of God on 2 tablets of stone, along with the detailed plans for a place where God's presence could dwell among them, the tabernacle. But while Moses was away, communing with God in the cloud, something terrible happened at the foot of the mountain. The people grew impatient. "Come, make us gods who will go before us," they demanded of Aaron. "As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." In a moment of catastrophic spiritual amnesia and weak leadership, Aaron, the high priest, caved. He collected their gold earrings, melted them down, and fashioned an idol, a golden calf, likely a symbol of strength and fertility they remembered from Egypt. And he declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." They built an altar before it, held a festival, and engaged in revelry. Almost before the sound of their "we will obey" had faded from the air, they had broken the first 2 and most important commandments. They had committed spiritual adultery. Up on the mountain, God told Moses what was happening. His anger was white hot. "I have seen these people," he said, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." It was a test. God offered Moses the chance to be a new Abraham, to be the father of a new nation built on the ashes of the old one. But Moses, who had grown from a reluctant leader into a true shepherd of his people, became an intercessor. He argued with God, reminding him of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He pleaded for the people, and in one of the most selfless prayers ever uttered, he later says, "But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses' intercession was successful. God relented from the disaster he had threatened. But when Moses came down the mountain and saw the calf and the dancing with his own eyes, his own anger flared. He threw the stone tablets down, shattering them at the foot of the mountain, a powerful symbol of the covenant that the people had just broken. He burned the calf, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. There was a swift and terrible judgment, but the nation was spared from annihilation. The covenant was in pieces. The relationship was fractured. How could a holy God live among such a rebellious people without his presence consuming them? The answer was the final set of instructions Moses had received on the mountain. The plan for the tabernacle. After a period of mourning and repentance and the renewal of the covenant, the people were invited to bring an offering to build a sanctuary for the Lord. And the same people who had given their gold for an idol now gave their treasures willingly and joyfully for the construction of God's dwelling place. The tabernacle was a masterpiece of symbolism, a portable Mount Sinai, a structured and gracious way for a holy God to dwell in the midst of a sinful people. It was a tent divided into 3 main areas. The outer courtyard, with its bronze altar for burnt offerings and a basin for washing, was where the sacrifices for sin were made. Inside the tent itself was the holy place, containing a golden lampstand, a table for the bread of the presence, and an altar of incense. And behind a thick, heavy veil was the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. This was the symbolic throne room of God on earth. Inside it was only one object, the Ark of the Covenant, a golden box containing the renewed tablets of the law, a pot of manna, and Aaron's staff. On top of the ark were 2 golden cherubim facing each other, and the space between them was the mercy seat, where God's presence was said to dwell, and where the high priest would sprinkle the blood of atonement once a year. The entire system, with its priests and its carefully prescribed sacrifices, was God's gracious provision for a covenant-breaking people. It was a way to deal with their sin, to find forgiveness, and to restore fellowship. It was a constant reminder of both the seriousness of sin — it required the shedding of blood — and the availability of grace. The terrifying, unapproachable holiness of Sinai was now contained and made accessible in a controlled way, right in the center of their camp. So this is the Mosaic covenant, the Sinai agreement. It's different from the unconditional promises to Noah and Abraham. This one is conditional. If you obey, then you will be my treasured possession. It's a bilateral agreement, like a marriage, with responsibilities on both sides. God's part was to be their God, to protect them, to provide for them, and to give them the land he had promised. Their part was to be his people, to obey his law, and to be a holy nation that would represent him to the world. The covenant was founded on a spectacular act of grace, the Exodus, but its continuation depended on obedience. The tragic story of the golden calf, happening right at the beginning, serves as a permanent warning. It showed that Israel, like all of humanity, was incapable of keeping the law perfectly. The law was good and holy and just, but it couldn't change the human heart. It could point out sin, but it couldn't cure it. And so, this covenant, with its laws, its priests, and its system of sacrifices, sets the stage for the rest of Israel's story, a story of repeated failure, patient forgiveness, and the growing longing for a new and better covenant. One that could do what the stone tablets never could: write God's law not on stone, but on the human heart itself. The tablets of the covenant were remade, the tabernacle was built, and the glorious, fiery presence of God that had terrified the people on Mount Sinai came to dwell in the Holy of Holies, right in the center of their camp. The law had been given, the sacrificial system established. Israel was now, officially, God's holy nation, his treasured possession. They had their constitution, their identity, and their God dwelling in their midst. All that was left was to march forward, and inherit the land promised to Abraham so many centuries before. But the journey from Sinai to Canaan, which should have taken a matter of weeks, stretched into a grueling 40-year ordeal in the wilderness. Why? Because of the persistent, stubborn unbelief in their hearts. When their spies returned from scouting the promised land, 10 of the 12 came back with a report of fear. Yes, the land was fruitful, flowing with milk and honey, but the cities were fortified and the people were giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, they lamented, and we looked the same to them. Their fear was contagious. The entire assembly wept and grumbled against Moses and Aaron, once again romanticizing their slavery. If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? It was a complete rejection of God's power and his promise. They had seen him dismantle the Egyptian empire and part the Red Sea, yet they believed a few tall locals were too big a challenge for him, and so God gave them what they wanted. That generation, the generation of the Exodus, would die in the wilderness. They would not enter the land they had refused to trust him for. Only their children and the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, would inherit the promise. So for 40 years, they wandered. An entire generation passed away. Moses, their faithful leader, was allowed only to see the promised land from a mountaintop before he, too, died. The leadership passed to Joshua, a man filled with the spirit of wisdom. And under his command, the new generation of Israel finally crossed the Jordan River and began the long, difficult conquest of Canaan. The book of Joshua is a story of miraculous victories and faithful obedience. But the book that follows it, the book of Judges, tells a different, much darker story. After Joshua's death, there was no single leader. The nation was a loose confederation of 12 tribes, each responsible for securing its own territory. And a grim, cyclical pattern emerged, repeating itself over and over for several hundred years. The people would forget the Lord and begin to worship the idols of the Canaanites around them. As a result, God would hand them over to their enemies to be oppressed. In their misery, the people would cry out to the Lord for help. God, in his mercy, would raise up a deliverer, a judge, who would rescue them. And for the rest of that judge's life, the land would have peace. But as soon as the judge died, the people would return to their idolatry, behaving even more corruptly than their ancestors. It was a downward spiral of disobedience, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. The era is summed up by the haunting final verse of the book. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The Sinai covenant, with its conditional "if you obey," was being systematically broken, generation after generation. The law was proving powerless to sustain their faithfulness. The nation was falling apart from the inside, mired in chaos, moral confusion, and constant external threats. And it's in this desperate context that the people began to clamor for something new. They decided they didn't just need a temporary deliverer, they needed a permanent solution. They needed a king. Last of the judges was a man named Samuel, a prophet and a priest who had served God faithfully his entire life. But in his old age, his sons, whom he had appointed as leaders, proved to be corrupt. The elders of Israel came to Samuel with a demand. "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." The request displeased Samuel, and it broke God's heart. "Listen to all that the people are saying to you," God told Samuel. "It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." Since the Exodus, God had been their king. He had ruled them directly through his prophets and judges. But now they wanted to be like everyone else. They wanted a human king they could see, a king who would march out at the head of their armies, a symbol of national pride and unity. God agreed to give them what they wanted, but he instructed Samuel to warn them solemnly of what a human king would do. "The king," Samuel told them, "will take your sons to be his soldiers and your daughters to be his perfumers and cooks. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your flocks. You yourselves will become his slaves," Samuel warned. "When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." So God gave them the king they wanted, a man who perfectly fit their worldly criteria. His name was Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin. The Bible says he was a head taller than anyone else, an impressive, handsome man from a wealthy family. He looked the part. When Samuel presented him to the people, they shouted, "Long live the king." And for a time, Saul was a successful military leader, uniting the tribes and winning victories against their enemies. But Saul's heart was not fully devoted to the Lord. His kingship was characterized by a fatal combination of insecurity and pride. He was more concerned with public opinion and his own reputation than with obeying God's commands. Turning point came in a battle against the Philistines. Saul and his army were waiting for Samuel to come and offer the pre-battle sacrifice. But Samuel was delayed, and Saul's men were starting to desert. Panicked, Saul took matters into his own hands and offered the sacrifice himself, a duty reserved for the priest alone. He usurped a role that was not his. When Samuel arrived, he rebuked him sternly. "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you." Because of this act of impatient, self-reliant disobedience, Samuel announced that Saul's kingdom would not endure. The final straw came a few years later. God, through Samuel, gave Saul a direct command to utterly destroy the Amalekites, a notoriously wicked and predatory people who had attacked Israel during their wilderness journey. The command was for total destruction: men, women, children, and livestock, a severe form of holy war reserved for those deemed incorrigibly evil. But Saul, once again, only partially obeyed. He and his army killed the people, but they spared the best of the sheep and cattle, and they took the Amalekite king, Agag, alive as a trophy. When Samuel confronted him, Saul's excuse was pious but disingenuous. The soldiers spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, he claimed. It was then that Samuel delivered one of the most famous rebukes in the Bible. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Saul's reign was over in God's eyes. He would remain on the throne for many years, but the Spirit of God had departed from him, replaced by a tormenting spirit of jealousy, paranoia, and rage. He was the king the people had asked for, but he was not the king God had chosen. And so God sent Samuel on a secret mission. Go to Bethlehem, he said. I have chosen one of the sons of a man named Jesse to be king. Samuel went, filled with trepidation, and had Jesse and his sons consecrated for a sacrifice. Then, one by one, Jesse's sons were brought before the prophet. First came Eliab, the eldest. He was tall and impressive, much like Saul. Samuel thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, and with each one the Lord said, the Lord has not chosen him. Finally, a bewildered Samuel asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? Jesse replied, there is still the youngest. He is tending the sheep. He was an afterthought, the boy who wasn't even considered important enough to be invited to the ceremony. Send for him, Samuel insisted. And so they brought him in. The Bible describes him as glowing with health and having a fine appearance and handsome features. His name was David, and the Lord said, rise and anoint him, this is the one. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed the young shepherd boy in the presence of his stunned brothers. And from that day on, the Bible says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. God had chosen a king after his own heart, not a warrior or a nobleman, but a shepherd, a musician and a poet, a boy who had spent his lonely hours in the wilderness learning to depend on God, composing songs of praise, and defending his flock from lions and bears. His rise to the throne would not be immediate. It would be a long and painful journey, a period of testing and refinement that would prepare him to be the greatest king Israel would ever know. His first public appearance was in the famous confrontation with the Philistine giant Goliath. While King Saul and the entire Israelite army cowered in fear, David, who was just a boy delivering food to his brothers, was incensed by the giant's blasphemous taunts. His motivation wasn't personal glory. It was a zealous concern for God's honor. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He demanded, armed with only a shepherd's sling and 5 smooth stones, but clothed in an unshakable faith in God's power. He faced the giant. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, David shouted, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The victory was swift and absolute. and it catapulted David into the national spotlight. He became a commander in Saul's army and a close friend to Saul's son, Jonathan. He was loved by the people, who sang songs about him. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. This very song of praise ignited the fire of Saul's jealousy. From that day on, Saul saw David as a rival, and his paranoia grew into a murderous obsession. He tried to kill David multiple times, even pinning him to the wall with a spear. David was forced to flee for his life, and he spent the next several years as a fugitive, living in caves, in foreign lands, in the wilderness, hunted like an animal by the very king he had served so faithfully. This long period in the wilderness was David's true royal training. It was here that his character was forged. Twice, he was given a perfect opportunity to kill Saul and seize the throne that had been promised to him. Once, he found Saul asleep and unguarded in a cave. His men urged him to strike. "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" But David refused. He secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and even for that his conscience troubled him. "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed," he said. He understood that Saul was still on the throne by God's permission, and it was God's job, not his, to remove him. On another occasion, he found Saul's entire camp asleep and snuck in with his nephew Abishai, who again begged for permission to kill the king. But David refused again. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? He simply took Saul's spear and water jug as proof that he had been there. David chose to trust God's timing, to wait for God to place him on the throne in his own way. He would not seize power through violence or rebellion. Eventually, Saul and his son Jonathan died in a battle against the Philistines, a tragic end for the first king of Israel. After a period of mourning and a brief civil war with Saul's remaining loyalists, the elders of all the tribes of Israel came to David in Hebron. "We are your own flesh and blood," they declared. "The Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" And there they anointed David king over all Israel, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, the fugitive from the caves of En-Gedi, was finally on the throne. One of David's first acts as king was to capture the city of Jerusalem, a Jebusite stronghold, and make it his political capital. But David knew that a nation needed more than just a political center. It needed a spiritual heart. And so he determined to bring the most sacred object in all of Israel, the Ark of the Covenant, to his new capital. The Ark had been languishing in obscurity for decades, a symbol of God's neglected presence. David wanted to bring God back to the center of the nation's life. The first attempt to move the Ark ended in disaster because they didn't follow the specific instructions in the law. But the second attempt was done with great reverence and joy. As the Ark was carried into Jerusalem by the Levites, King David, overwhelmed with ecstatic joy, danced before the Lord with all his might. He was wearing a simple linen ephod, the garment of a priest, not the robes of a king. He was stripped of his royal dignity, celebrating before his true king with pure, uninhibited worship. His wife Michal, Saul's daughter, saw him from a window and despised him in her heart for his undignified display. But David's response reveals the essence of his heart for God. It was before the Lord. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. Unlike Saul, who was obsessed with his own image, David was utterly consumed with giving glory to God. With the ark safely in a tent in Jerusalem and the nation finally at peace, David was living in his beautiful new palace, paneled with cedar, and a thought began to trouble him. He said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." It was a noble desire. David, the man of worship, wanted to build a permanent, magnificent house for God, a temple to replace the portable tabernacle. Nathan initially gave him the green light, but that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan with a very different message for the king. It is this message that forms the heart of the Davidic covenant, a promise so vast and far-reaching that it would shape the rest of the biblical story. God's message to David, delivered by Nathan, was a beautiful and gentle no, followed by an astonishing. But God begins by reminding David of his humble origins. "I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel." He reminds David that he has never asked for a house of cedar, that he has been content to dwell in a tent, moving with his people. And then, God completely flips David's proposal on its head. David wanted to build a house, a temple for God. God responds by saying, "No, you will not build a house for me, but I am going to build a house, a dynasty for you." This is the promise, recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It is a series of unconditional vows from God to David. First, God promises to give his people Israel a permanent, secure place. "I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed." This is the ultimate fulfillment of the land promise to Abraham. Second, God reaffirms the promise to make David's name great, a promise he has already been fulfilling. Third, and this is the core of it, God promises to establish David's dynasty. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. Fourth, God specifies that this immediate offspring, his son, will be the one to build the temple. He is the one who will build a house for my name. Fifth, and this is where the promise explodes into eternity, God says, "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." It wasn't just that David's son would be king. It was that his royal line, his throne, would have no end. Sixth, God defines a new, intimate relationship with David's royal heir. "I will be his father, and he will be my son." This is a language of adoption, of a special, loving relationship between God and the king. And finally, God makes the promise unbreakable. This is what distinguishes it so sharply from the way God dealt with Saul. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This is staggering. This covenant is not conditional. It doesn't say if your son obeys. It anticipates that the son will do wrong. There will be consequences. There will be discipline. But the promise of an eternal dynasty and God's steadfast love heased in Hebrew will never be revoked. The security of the kingdom rests not on the king's righteousness, but on God's unwavering, unconditional promise. When Nathan delivered this message, David was completely overwhelmed. He went and sat before the Lord, and his prayer of response is one of the most beautiful and humble in all of Scripture. Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant, and this is not a matter for ordinary men. How great you are, sovereign Lord! There is no one like you, and there is no God but you. And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised. He was a man completely undone by the sheer grace of God. David was a man after God's own heart, but he was not a man with a perfect heart. And the story takes a dark and tragic turn that demonstrates both the depth of human sin and the unshakable nature of God's covenant promise. It happened in the prime of his life, at the height of his power. It was springtime, the time when kings go off to war. But David stayed behind in Jerusalem. One evening, from the roof of his palace, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. He sent for her, slept with her, and she conceived. It was a terrible abuse of his power, a violation of the trust of one of his most loyal soldiers, Uriah the Hittite, who was Bathsheba's husband and was away fighting David's battles. In a desperate attempt to cover his sin, David arranged for Uriah to be sent to the front lines of the fiercest fighting, and then had the other soldiers withdraw from him, ensuring his death. Adultery was now compounded by murder. David took Bathsheba as his wife, and for a time, it seemed he had gotten away with it. But the Bible adds a chilling sentence. The thing David had done displeased the Lord. God sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king. Nathan told him a parable about a rich man with many flocks who stole the one beloved ewe lamb of a poor man to feed a guest. David's righteous anger flared. As surely as the Lord lives, he declared, the man who did this must die. And Nathan pointed his finger at the king and said the three most terrifying words he would ever hear. You are the man. Nathan laid out David's sin in excruciating detail and pronounced God's judgment. The child conceived in adultery would die. And because David had acted with such contempt for the Lord, the sword would never depart from his house. David's response was not an excuse, or a rationalization. It was immediate and absolute confession. I have sinned against the Lord. His repentance was deep and genuine, and it is immortalized in the raw grief of Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Nathan assured him, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Here is the covenant in action. David was forgiven. God's steadfast love was not removed, but the consequences of his sin were inescapable and devastating. The baby died, and the rest of David's reign was plagued by family tragedy. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. Her brother Absalom murdered Amnon in revenge. Absalom later led a rebellion against David, driving his own father from Jerusalem and publicly shamming him. The sword, as God had promised, did not depart from his house. The covenant held, but sin left deep and permanent scars. Before he died, David passed the kingdom to his son with Bathsheba, Solomon. And Solomon fulfilled the first part of the covenant promise. He built the temple, a magnificent structure that took 7 years to complete, a permanent house for the name of the Lord. At its dedication, the glory of the Lord filled the temple so powerfully that the priests could not even stand to minister. Solomon's reign was the golden age of Israelite history, a time of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and wisdom. He was the son who built God's house. But even Solomon, the wisest man in the world, was not the perfect, eternal king. In his old age, his many foreign wives, whom he had married for political alliances, turned his heart away from the Lord to worship other gods. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. And because of this, God announced that he would tear the kingdom away from Solomon's son, leaving only one tribe, Judah, for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem. And so, the Davidic covenant created a new tension, a new longing in the heart of Israel. They had this unconditional promise of a king on an eternal throne. They had a son of David reigning in Jerusalem. But king after king, generation after generation, the sons of David proved to be flawed, sinful, and disappointing. The kingdom eventually split in two, and both the northern and southern kingdoms spiraled into idolatry, injustice, and eventual exile. The physical throne of David in Jerusalem was toppled. The last king was carried off in chains to Babylon. It seemed like the promise had failed, but it hadn't. The prophets, speaking in the darkest days of the exile, began to reinterpret the Davidic covenant. They spoke of a future king, a new branch from the stump of Jesse, a righteous son of David who would come and fulfill the promise in a way no earthly king ever could. He would be the ultimate fulfillment of the "I will be his father, and he will be my son" promise. He would be a king who would not sin, whose kingdom would truly have no end, and through whom the Abrahamic promise of blessing all nations would finally be realized. The Davidic covenant, therefore, becomes the anchor of all messianic hope. It narrows the promise from a nation to a family, from a family to a single royal line. It provides the lens through which to read the rest of the Old Testament as a story of waiting. Waiting for the true Shepherd King, the Anointed One, the Son of David, who would not just rule from a throne in Jerusalem, but from an eternal throne in the hearts of his people, bringing a kingdom of justice and peace that would truly never end. The promise to David of an eternal throne was a high point, a glorious mountain peak in the story of Israel. From that vantage, it seemed as though the kingdom would last forever, a beacon of light and justice in a dark world. But the story of humanity is a story of mountains and valleys, and after the golden age of Solomon, the nation began a long, slow, and heartbreaking descent into a very deep valley indeed. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was a fool. His arrogance split the kingdom in two. The 10 northern tribes formed their own kingdom, called Israel, and immediately plunged into idolatry. The 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained loyal to the house of David and were known as the Kingdom of Judah. For the next several hundred years, the 2 kingdoms limped along, their history a sad litany of political intrigue, warfare, and most tragically, spiritual adultery. King after king, in both the north and the south, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They built high places for idol worship. They erected Asherah poles. They followed the detestable practices of the nations around them. They broke the Sinai covenant with spectacular and relentless consistency. God, in his long-suffering patience, sent them prophet after prophet, men like Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, who called them back to faithfulness, who pleaded with them to repent, who warned them of the coming judgment. But for the most part, the people and their kings refused to listen. Eventually, God's patience, though vast, reached its limit. The covenant curses that Moses had warned about centuries earlier were about to be enacted. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the brutal Assyrian Empire. Its people were deported and scattered, lost to history as the 10 lost tribes. The southern kingdom of Judah held on for another century and a half, but they didn't learn from their brother's fate. Despite the passionate warnings of the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, and a few brief moments of righteous reform under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, they too spiraled into apostasy. And so the end came. In 586 BC, the mighty Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, descended on Jerusalem. They laid siege to the city, and after a long and terrible famine, they breached the walls. They burned the city to the ground. They tore down the magnificent temple of Solomon, the house that was meant to be a dwelling place for God's name forever. They took the last king of David's line, Zedekiah, forced him to watch his own sons being executed, and then blinded him and dragged him away in chains to Babylon. The people were deported, forced to march in a long, sorrowful train out of the land of promise and into exile. It was an absolute catastrophe, the lowest point in Israel's history. Every covenant seemed to have failed. The promise of the land given to Abraham was lost. were no longer in it. The Sinai covenant, the law of Moses, was shattered beyond repair. Their disobedience had led to the very curses Moses had foretold. The Davidic covenant, the promise of an eternal throne, seemed like a bitter joke. The throne was empty, the king was a blinded prisoner, and the royal city was a smoking ruin. The Ark of the Covenant vanished from history, never to be seen again. It seemed like God had abandoned his people, that the great story of salvation had come to a tragic and premature end. It is in this darkness, in the heart of this despair, that the prophets began to speak a new word. A word that was not just about judgment, but about a future hope so radical it was almost impossible to believe. They were men like Jeremiah, who had wept over Jerusalem's destruction, and Ezekiel, who was a priest among the exiles in Babylon. And they began to diagnose the root of the problem. The problem, they said, wasn't really with the law. The law given at Sinai was good and holy. The problem was with the people. The problem was in the human heart. They described it as a heart of stone, hard, stubborn, rebellious, and incapable of truly obeying God's commands. Simply giving them an external law, even a perfect one written on tablets of stone, was like giving a complex musical score to a man with no hands. The score might be beautiful, but he was fundamentally incapable of playing it. And so, inspired by God, these prophets began to speak of a future restoration, a new act of God that would be different from anything that had come before. It would not be a mere repeat of the Exodus. It would be something deeper, something internal. The most famous and beautiful of these prophecies comes from the prophet Jeremiah in the 31st chapter of his book. As his people sat in the dust of their failure, Jeremiah spoke these astonishing words from God. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah, a new covenant." The very word must have sent a shockwave of hope through the exiled community. God wasn't finished. He was planning to start again, but on a completely new basis. And Jeremiah is very specific about how it will be new. He continues, "It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them." God explicitly states that the old model, the Sinai Agreement, is being superseded. That covenant was conditional, and the human partner had failed to keep their side of the bargain. It was a broken marriage, so the new covenant would have to operate on a different principle. And here is the radical difference. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. Just let that beautiful image sink in for a moment. The law was no longer going to be an external code written on stone tablets that could be shattered at the foot of a mountain. It was going to be an internal reality. God was going to perform a kind of divine heart surgery. He was going to inscribe his desires, his character, his very law onto the core of their being. This meant that obedience would no longer be a matter of reluctant, grudging duty, a response to an outside pressure. It would flow from a new inner desire. People would obey God not because they had to, but because they wanted to. their hearts would be aligned with his. It would be like a musician who doesn't just read the score, but has the music living inside of him, flowing out through his fingers naturally and joyfully. The result of this internal change would be the restoration of the relationship to its ideal state. I will be their God, and they will be my people. This is the classic language of covenant, but now it's based on a transformed heart, not a fragile promise of human obedience. And this new relationship would be intensely personal. Jeremiah continues, "No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest." This doesn't mean there will be no more teachers. It means that the fundamental knowledge of God will not be secondhand, mediated exclusively through a priestly class or a prophet. Every single person in the covenant community, from the most important to the most humble, would have a direct, personal, intimate relationship with God. They would know Him in their hearts. And what is the foundation for this incredible new reality? How is it all possible? Jeremiah gives the final, glorious reason, the engine that drives the entire new covenant. "For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." This is the bedrock. The new covenant is founded on a radical, absolute, and unconditional act of divine forgiveness. The accumulated debt of sin that had caused the failure of the Sinai covenant and led to the exile would be wiped clean. Not just overlooked, but forgiven. And not just forgiven, but forgotten. "I will remember their sins no more." For God, to remember is to act. To forget is to pledge never to act on that sin again, to never hold it against them. This promise of a total, cleansing grace is what makes the new heart and the personal relationship possible. The prophet Ezekiel, also speaking to the exiles, described this same reality using a different but equally powerful set of images. In the 36th chapter of his book, God says, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." There it is again, that divine heart surgery. The lifeless, unresponsive stone is replaced with living, beating, feeling flesh. A heart that can love, that can respond, that can be hurt, that can rejoice. And he goes even further than Jeremiah in explaining how this new heart will be able to obey. "And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws." It wasn't just that they would have a new heart with new desires. God's own Spirit, His personal presence and power, would come and live inside them, empowering them, moving them from within to live a life that was pleasing to Him. The new covenant wasn't just about a new standard written on the heart. It was about a new power living in the heart. These were astonishing promises, a glimmer of dawn in the darkest night of the exile. The people eventually did return from Babylon. They rebuilt Jerusalem and a second, more modest temple. But they lived for centuries under foreign domination, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. They still had the law of Moses, but they could see that the glorious promises of Jeremiah and Ezekiel had not yet been fully realized. the heart of the people, by and large, remained hard. A deep sense of longing and anticipation settled over the land. They were waiting for the promised son of David to come and restore the kingdom. Waiting for the Messiah. Waiting for the one who would finally usher in this new covenant of the heart. And then, after 400 years of prophetic silence, in a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire, a baby was born in Bethlehem, the city of David. His name was Jesus. As he grew into a man, it became clear that he was no ordinary prophet. He spoke with a unique authority. He healed the sick, cast out demons, and had power over the forces of nature. And he began to speak as if he himself were the fulfillment of Israel's entire story. He presented himself as the true offspring of Abraham, the one through whom the blessing would finally come to all nations. He acted as a new Moses, going up on a mountain to deliver the true interpretation of the law, a law that went to the heart. He identified himself as the ultimate Passover lamb, the one whose sacrifice would truly deliver people from their slavery, not to Egypt, but to sin and death. And he claimed to be the long-awaited son of David, the king who had come to establish a kingdom, though he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He was the living, breathing embodiment of all the covenants, converging in one person. The climax, the moment where he explicitly brings the new covenant into being, happens on the last night of his life. He is in an upper room in Jerusalem with his 12 closest disciples, celebrating the Passover meal, the annual feast that commemorated their deliverance from Egypt. This meal was the very heart of the Old Covenant identity. And Jesus takes this ancient, sacred ritual and redefines it around himself. He took the unleavened bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He was identifying himself with the broken bread, the bread of affliction that symbolized their suffering in Egypt. Then, after the supper, he took the cup of wine, the cup of redemption, and he said the words that changed everything, the words that officially inaugurated the new age that Jeremiah had prophesied. "This cup," he said, "is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." In that one sentence, he pulled all the threads together. The new covenant that Jeremiah had promised was here. It was being established right now in this room. And what was the seal, the ratifying agent of this covenant? Not the blood of bulls and goats, like at Sinai. It was his own blood, his life poured out. And for what purpose? For the forgiveness of sins. The very foundation of Jeremiah's promise. Jesus was declaring that his impending death was not a tragic accident, but a willing, sacrificial, covenant-establishing death that would deal with the problem of human sin once and for all, making possible the new heart, the indwelling spirit, and the intimate knowledge of God. The next day, he was crucified. On the cross, Jesus, the perfect Son of David and the sinless Son of God, took upon himself the curse of the broken Sinai covenant. He absorbed the full weight of the judgment that all people deserved for their rebellion. His death was the ultimate sacrifice, the final atonement to which all the temple sacrifices had been pointing. It was the price paid to secure the forgiveness of wickedness and the remembering of sins no more. But the story doesn't end in the darkness of the grave. 3 days later, he rose again. His resurrection was the divine vindication. It was God the Father's Amen to Jesus's "It is finished." It was the proof that the sacrifice had been accepted, that sin had been paid for, and that death itself, the ultimate consequence of sin, had been conquered. The resurrection is the power source of the new covenant. It's what makes the promise of a new heart and a new spirit a living reality, and not just a beautiful idea. It means that those who are joined to Christ by faith are no longer defined by their old, stony-hearted nature, but by his new, resurrected life. And then came the final piece of the puzzle. Before he ascended into heaven, Jesus told his disciples to wait in Jerusalem for the gift his Father had promised, the Holy Spirit. And on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, it happened. The disciples were gathered together, and suddenly a sound like a violent wind filled the house, and they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. This was the fulfillment of Ezekiel's promise. I will put my spirit in you. God's own presence was no longer confined to a temple made of stone, but was now making its home in the hearts of his people, in a temple made of flesh. The new covenant had been inaugurated by Jesus' blood, and now it was being personally applied and empowered by his Spirit. And we see the immediate effects. These once fearful men burst out into the streets, proclaiming the good news of Jesus with boldness, and in a beautiful reversal of the Tower of Babel, where languages were confused to scatter people. Here the Spirit enabled the disciples to speak in other tongues, so that pilgrims from all over the world heard the message in their own native language. The new covenant was for all people. So what does it mean to live in this new covenant? It means that our relationship with God is not based on our ability to keep a set of external rules. It's based on his grace, on the finished work of Jesus Christ. It means that through faith, we have been given the radical, complete forgiveness that Jeremiah promised. Our sins are not just covered, they are gone, remembered no more. It means we have been given a new heart, a heart of flesh that desires God, and that his law of love is now our internal compass, not our external taskmaster. And it means we have been given his Spirit to live inside us, to guide us, to comfort us, and to empower us to live a new kind of life. The signs of this covenant are not a rainbow in the sky or a mark on the body, but the inward reality of a changed heart and the outward rituals of baptism and communion. Baptism is the sign of our union with Christ in his death and resurrection, the washing away of the old life. And communion, the Lord's Supper, is the ongoing family meal of the covenant community, where we remember the broken body and shed blood that established this covenant and proclaimed his death until he comes again. And so, our long journey through the covenants comes to its conclusion. Each one was a different chapter in the same grand story, the story of God's relentless, unwavering love for his creation. The Noahic covenant, with its rainbow, provided the stable stage upon which the drama of redemption could unfold. A promise that God would preserve the world in patience and not destroy it. The Abrahamic covenant, with its promise of stars, chose the people, a single family that would become a nation through whom God would work to bring blessing to the entire world. The Mosaic covenant, with its tablets of stone, provided the holy law, a perfect standard that revealed God's character, structured the life of his nation, and ultimately exposed their inability to be righteous on their own, revealing their deep need for a Savior. The Davidic covenant, with its promise of an eternal throne, identified the king who would come from that chosen people, a son of David who would save them and rule forever. And finally, the new covenant, sealed with the blood of Jesus, is the glorious fulfillment of all that came before. In Jesus, the blessing promised to Abraham extends to all nations. In Jesus, we find our true exodus from slavery to sin. In Jesus, the righteous demands of the law are perfectly fulfilled. And in Jesus, the Son of David, we find our gentle, loving, and eternal King. It's the final, unbreakable promise. A promise of a completely forgiven past, a spirit-empowered present, and an unshakable hope for the future. It doesn't depend on our performance, but on his. It's a relationship based not on what we do for God, but on what he has, in his incredible love, done for us. It's the ultimate love story, the final word of which is not law, but grace. It's now late here, just past 9:45 p.m. in my little corner of Da Nang, and the city is quieting down. I hope wherever you are, whatever time it is, that this story has brought you a sense of peace. The story of God's unbreakable promises is, in the end, a story of his faithfulness. A faithfulness that holds the world together, that pursues us through our failures, and that finally brings us home through a new covenant of grace. It's a good story to fall asleep to, because it reminds us that even while we rest, the God who makes and keeps his promises is awake, and he is holding all things, including us, in his loving hands.